Welcome all. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Buffett Center. I'm Hendrik Spruit. Welcome all. It's always good to see a full room. Just a week ago we had Tariq Ramadan here with a standing audience, and now we're doing the same thing with David Harvey. So it's very nice to see all of you here again, and welcome. I'll just say a few quick words about David Harvey, although I think we all know who he is. He is, at this point, the distinguished professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Prior to that, he was at Johns Hopkins University. And before that, I believe the Harold Mackinder Professor of Geography, an aptly named chair, actually. He's the author of 16 to 17 books by my count, and far more articles than that. He works across the fields of anthropology, sociology, political science. In fact, truly a Renaissance man who can speak on many, many topics, and it's a true pleasure to have him here. He's going to speak about his latest book, The Enigma of Capital. I think we're going to go on for about 45 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. We will stop strictly at sharply at 8:30 because there's another engagement shortly after this one. All right. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Harvey to Northwestern.
You know, one of the things I like to do when I write a book is to ask the question, what can I say about something or a situation that other people are not saying? And when I was invited to write this book by an old friend of mine who now works for a London publisher, I asked myself exactly that question. And actually it turns out it's not too hard to do that because A, I'm a Marxist and there aren't many of us around, and B, I'm a geographer, and actually as a Marxist and a geographer you sort of reduce the possible perspectives, rival perspectives, to a very, very narrow group of people. So I set out to do it that way, and the center of it was really crude in when I read the following incident, which I really liked a lot. When Her Majesty the Queen went to London School of Economics to open some building somewhere, she had a lunch afterwards, and she turned to the economists there and she said, "How come you guys didn't see this thing coming?" Well, she didn't say it that way because Her Majesty wouldn't say that. So, and the result was the economists, it was the kind of question I would like to ask of economists, but they'd never give me the time of day of giving me an answer. But, Her Majesty has a kind of sort of feudal residual power. and the economists of the British Academy decided to put together a whole group of people, and so they got about 20 or 30 of them, including the Governor of the Bank of England, to try and provide an answer to Her Majesty as to how come they had not seen the crisis coming. And the letter they wrote 6 months later was actually a bit astonishing. The gist of it was that they had all been working extremely hard on understanding various aspects of the system, and they had worked through very rigorously what had been happening. But the one thing they all seemed to have missed was systemic risk. Now, to me, if you're doing with anything, I would have thought systemic risk would be the central thing you'd be concerned with. And the systemic risks of an economic system should be surely at the centerpiece of your concern. They then went on to kind of say, and of course we were all caught up in the politics of denial, which is a polite way of saying that they were all caught up in the euphoria of everything was going fine and lovely, and we were in the great moderation and all those other things. So I thought, well, I'd try and help them out with systemic risk, which, of course, in my language means the internal contradictions of capitalism. So I thought I'd write a little book to give them some instruction on how the internal contradictions of capitalism produce crises periodically, and what those crises might look like, and how going into them and coming out of them has a certain kind of dynamic. Now, it turns out that just recently the International Monetary Fund issued a big report on the question of systemic risk, and it said, well, the study of systemic risk is in its infancy, we have a lot of work to do, we're really beginning on it now. And then the former chief economist of the World Bank said, well, don't expect anything fast because, you know, this sort of thing takes an awful lot of time to work out. So I was very gratified when I actually got rather a nice review of the Enigma of Capital in the IMF House Journal. So, and I thought, well, actually I am going to save them a lot of time. And the guy kind of said, well, you know, the arguments here are rather interesting and we should pay attention to them. And it ended up saying the following: do I buy his argument? No, not yet. Would I buy this book? Definitely. And I thought, well, you know, that's a pretty good endorsement coming from the IMF. On the other hand, I also thought getting a good endorsement from the IMF suggests I've done something terribly wrong. And this was made even worse by the fact I got a not a bad review in the Financial Times. So I'm beginning to get seriously worried, but for various reasons, and I can understand this, I'm getting worse reviews from the Marxist left than I am getting them from organizations and institutions like that. And I think I'll try and explain a little bit why. Now, in setting this up, I wanted to try to look at a whole set of ideas. And one of the ideas which is central to the book is the idea of what you might call moving around, the moving around of the crisis. And there's moving around in a double sense. That is, a crisis which has a certain configuration at a certain historical moment gets resolved, but in being resolved, it actually generates the next crisis, which has a different appearance. And so the relationships between the crises and the dynamics of the crises become very significant. The crisis also gets moved around geographically. And it's very interesting, in this country, of course, we're still sort of fussing a great deal with the nature of this crisis, but China, of course, has been growing at around 8 or 10%. Argentina is growing at 8%. In many parts of the world, people kind of say, well, there was a little bit of a problem, and then we went through it, and we're out of it, and we're on our way. And I think the centrality of the crisis here is best recorded in just a couple of, I think, very important facts. The first is that the IMF and the ILO produced a joint report the other day on the employment problem, and they said, well, in the advanced capitalist countries, the net job loss at this time is something like 15 million, 7 million of it in the United States, and another 3 million of it in Britain and Spain alone. So the unemployment situation is highly concentrated, and it's highly concentrated in the United States. The second thing is that if you look temporally, the last few recessions in the United States have been followed by what are called jobless recoveries. And this is very unusual. Usually when you come out of a recession, jobs sort of come back, but in 1991-92 they didn't come back very much at all, and they didn't come back after 2001-2002. And this time it's even worse because it looks like not only are jobs not coming back, but even more jobs are being lost. So this suggests that the United States in particular is a very parlous state right now, and therefore there is a geographical concentration of the problem here, which preoccupies us in ways which it doesn't preoccupy people in many other parts of the world. Any country that is heavily reorienting to the China trade these days is doing fine. Australia, for example, has been booming along, hardly felt the crisis because it's providing raw materials to China. Much of Latin America has come out of it by providing raw materials to China. I mean, some of the environmental consequences of turning most of Latin America into one sort of vast soybean plantation is really serious, but on the other hand, economically, they're coming out okay. So when I talk about the moving around, I think you sort of look at that. But then even geographically, when you look at the history of the crisis, you see that the epicenter of it was the southwest of the United States and the housing market there, and also in Florida and a little bit in Georgia. I mean, yeah, there's a foreclosure crisis everywhere, but actually those are the big centers of it. And those big centers are having very, very hard time recovering. I mean, sort of Nevada, Arizona, Southern California in particular. But it was this sort of geographical concentration of the subprime lending, reckless and predatory behaviors and all the rest of it, which actually then sort of got into the financial system and went viral inside of the financial system. But then the financial system sort of, when it went global, as it did after the Lehman collapse of September 2008, sent out kind of a whole bunch of kind of effects, varying a great deal from some German banks who'd been silly enough to invest in collateralized debt obligations and things of that sort, and municipalities in Norway or whoever had invested in it. If the banking system had not invested in it, the banking system was relatively untroubled. So that, for example, the Canadian banking industry has been relatively untroubled through this whole thing. The Indian banking industry has been relatively untroubled through this whole thing. And of course, India is also growing at around 6 or 7% right now. And East and Southeast Asia was not bothered by it. And here's an interesting kind of thing which kind of geographically looks very, very significant to me, which is that the crisis of 1997-98 was very much focused on East and Southeast Asia. Now that very nearly went global, very nearly. And it was just about stopped in South Korea by getting together of the US Treasury and the IMF and World Bank and everybody who kind of prevented that crisis going global. Now, the nature of that crisis was those countries were caught with very little reserves to deal with a speculative attack. And in effect, as they came out of the crisis, which they did by exporting to the United States, so they started to take measures to try to make sure they never got hit by a speculative attack like that again. Because in effect what happened is speculative money withdrew. It was a highly debt-leveraged economic situation in many of those countries like Thailand and Indonesia and all the rest of it. Industries couldn't roll over their debt and so went bankrupt. In came foreign capital, particularly from the US and Europe and Japan, bought up those industries, waited for 2 or 3 years for things to recover, then sold them back at an immense profit. In other words, people made a load of money out of the East and Southeast Asian crisis, and a lot of that money went to Wall Street, a lot of it went to Japan, and a lot of it went to Europe. Now this time around, however, they have the surpluses, and they deliberately cultivated the surpluses. So when the mess started, they were in a much better position to deal with this. So their response was simply, well, okay, we have the surpluses, we're not going to be hit this way. So they have come out of it fairly fast. And in some ways, you can almost view this crisis as payback time from East and Southeast Asia. I mean, I'm quite serious about this. I mean, it sort of has that flavor to it, that they're now in a position to come out of this and at the same time put the fires under the United States and keep the recession going here full blast. So that's what I mean about moving around. It's moving around geographically like that. And there's some curious incidents. I mean, I don't know what you feel, but as I live through this, I wonder where the next place is going to erupt. I mean, all of a sudden about this time last year, Dubai World went under. And I thought, well, I didn't think the Gulf states were vulnerable. But they had to be bailed out by Abu Dhabi and all this kind of stuff. So suddenly then, and the next thing, suddenly Greece is in trouble, and suddenly Portugal and Spain and Ireland are all in trouble. And Ireland is an incredible state right now. And it's so interesting that 5 years ago, the main buyers of condominium spaces in Manhattan were Irish. They had so much surplus capital running around, they didn't know what to do with it. And everybody was joking, they used to come as laborers and all this kind of thing, and navvies on the railroad and so on. And now they're coming in and they're condominium buyers. They're flipping condominiums in Manhattan. But now, of course, the Irish thing has gone bust. So I don't know. And it's just interesting to ask and think, where's the next explosion likely to be, and where's it going to be geographically, and what's it going to do to the rest of the system? And one of the places which is expanding very rapidly right now is, of course, China. But there are many signs of overproduction in China, overaccumulation in China, and there are serious kind of questions about whether China can maintain its growth path. So the geographical dimensions of this are, to me, really very, very important. But as I also mentioned, we also have to deal with the temporal dimensions, and the temporal dimensions are indeed much better handled by Marx's theory of crisis and crisis formation. And in order to write this book, I had, in a way, to try to rewrite some ideas about what Marx's theory of crisis formation is. And one of the things I have to constantly tell my students, and I'll also tell you, is you've got to be very careful about putting too much faith in Marx's one-liners. When Marx kind of says the falling rate of profit theory is the most important law or something like that, and people give that to me as a one-liner and say, why aren't you emphasizing that? And I say, well, that was a one-liner. Elsewhere he said something like, well, it's not really a law, it's a tendency, or it's a law of a tendency, or it's a tendency of a law. And then he kind of says, there's a lot of counteracting influences, and when you count them all up from everywhere, you find actually there's so many counteracting instances, you wonder whether the law will ever work at all. So you have to look at what Marx does, rather than what those one-liners. And in looking at what he does, and this is, if you like, one of the things that's come out of teaching Capital all these years, I'm very familiar what he does. And the Marx project, which I now kind of think of as putting Volume 1 lectures online, we're now gearing up to put the Volume 2 lectures online. But in doing that, then people can see what he does. And as you see what he does, you come out with a rather different interpretation than you come out with one-liners. And it's this interpretation, it seems to me, which is absolutely crucial. For example, falling rate of profit argument it's not entirely wrong, but it's just one aspect. But here we have a crisis in which clearly we can't talk about its dynamics without talking about the financial system. And the falling rate of profit says absolutely nothing about the financial system. Secondly, we can't talk about this crisis without talking about consumerism. If 70% of the growth dynamic right now in American economy is consumer sentiment and consumerism, then you need actually to get both finance and consumerism into the picture in order to talk about the formation of this crisis. And to do that, you need then to look at how Marx handles issues of this kind. Now, one of the ways in which I think he handles this is to sort of lay out, and it is particularly a Volume 2 analysis rather than a Volume 1 or Volume 3 analysis, a Volume 2 analysis which is about the flow of capital. And Marx talks about a system in which capital is really defined by money being used to make more money. And there are various ways you can make more money. I mean, there are all kinds of illegal ways you can do it, and we've seen a lot of that, of course, through what I call accumulation by dispossession, for all these foreclosures and all the rest of it, a lot of illegal practices and so on. But a healthy capitalist economy is presumably one where you can make more money legally by going through the market. And so what Marx does is to set up a way you can do that. Now, you can do it a variety of ways. I mean, you can just have money, you can lend it out for interest, you can get land and you can rent the land out, or property, or you can get assets, or you can rent them out or something like that, or you can gain intellectual property rights and charge royalties for their utilization, those kinds of things. But the way Marx sets up is that, well, a healthy capitalist economy is one where it's going to be expanding through the exploitation of living labor in production. And the system he sets up is really very simple. Money is taken into the marketplace where it buys two kinds of commodities, labor power and means of production. Those two commodities are then brought together in a labor process under given conditions of organizational power and also given technologies. And that labor process then produces a commodity which is sold in the market for more money than you started out with. I mean, that's the standard, if you like, sort of argument. Now, if you look at that system, there are a number of things you can say about it. The first thing is that its continuity is terribly important. If it doesn't keep on going, flowing very far, then there's a crisis. Any blockage in that system is a crisis. And Marx, in many parts in the Grundrisse and also in Volume 2 of Capital, says these blockages are points of crisis, potential points of crisis. So the continuity is fundamental. And you can see that actually in all sorts of ways. I mean, you look at the impact, for instance, of 9/11. I mean, I was living in New York. All movement stopped. The flow stopped. Nothing seemed to be happening. And within 4 or 5 days, Giuliani was coming on television and saying, for God's sake, get your credit cards out and get back in shopping. You know, and go around Broadway, there are all these shows, and there are empty seats, and the restaurants around. Go on out and have a good time, you know. Get the economy moving again. And Bush came on television in an collective ad for the airlines saying, for God's sake, get back and start flying. So and you remember when the Icelandic bankers took revenge by erupting a volcano, you know, and what impact that had upon I mean, billions were lost, right, over all of that. So you know, so the continuity is terribly important. The second thing is the system has to expand. That it has to grow. There's more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning of the day. And for certain reasons, there's an interesting point about what do people do with the profit they got at the end of the day? Do they, you know, do they spend it like you and I might do and have a good time? Or are they forced by certain features to reinvest part of it? And the answer is, yeah, they have to reinvest in order to remain capitalist. And I won't go into exactly why. It's a simple story and there's a complicated story about that. But the result of this is that capitalism is about growth. It's always about growth. It always has been. And the data show that since around 1750 or 1780 or whenever, capitalism has grown at the rate of something like 2.25% per annum, okay, at a compound rate. Compound rate, that's a crucial thing. It's a compound rate of growth. Now, actually, if you go to the financial press right now, people kind of will go on and kind of say, well, things are pretty sluggish if they're 2%. You know, this evening I saw something where it said, well, economists have downgraded their forecast of the growth of the US economy. It's down to about 2.7%. It was 3.2%, and this is getting bad when it's 2.7%. So there seems to be a minimum growth rate of around 3%. Which is acceptable, and people feel happy if you're growing at 4 or 5%. And in the history of capitalism, there have been periods when it's been growing in aggregate at 4 or 5%, as it did in the 1950s and 1960s. Other times when it's been 0%, as in the 1930s and as it was in 2008. So there's lots of differences, but you know, 3% compound growth is, if you like, a basic kind of rule which seems to govern the dynamics of capitalism. Now, 3% compound growth has certain implications. When you're talking about 3% compound growth, when capital was constituted by what was going on in Manchester and Birmingham and a few other hot spots in, say, 1750 or 1780, that's one thing. But you're now talking about compound growth on everything that's going on in Europe and North America and Japan, most of what's now going on in China, a lot of what's going on in India and Indonesia and Eastern Europe and Russia, you know, Latin America and all the rest of it. I mean, 3% compound growth on all of that starts to look more and more stressful and more more And actually, if you sort of say to yourself, can we have 3% compound growth forever? You start to say, well, you know, no, that just doesn't make sense. And in monetary terms, the global economy right now is around $55 trillion. 3% compound growth means that you've got to start thinking about finding new investment opportunities for something like $1.5 trillion right now, going up to $3 trillion by the time you get to sort of 2030 or so. So you're really looking at having to find profitable investment opportunities for more and more money. And there is what I call in the book a capital surplus absorption problem. How are you going to actually find places to put that are profitable? And one of the arguments I would make is if you look back over the last 30 years, you would see actually some very interesting signs that capital has been having real difficulty in doing this in productive kinds of and meaningful ways. So you start to get, you know, investment in assets, and so you get asset bubbles, and so you start to create fictitious markets in which all kinds of money can go in and start to, you know, and every time something comes along, somebody uses it an opportunity to create a fictitious market. I mean, Al Gore's great gift to humanity was to say, well, okay, there's a climate change problem. How do we solve it? We create a market in carbon trading futures. What? Yeah, I mean, it has no impact whatsoever on the environment, but it's a great new market, and of course you can start to invest in derivatives of the market and futures in the market. So, and it's already quite strong. The futures, carbon trading futures market in Europe is already quite strong, quite big. It'll soon become huge. And these markets start to circulate vast amounts of money. For instance, in 2006, if you add up all the currency swaps and the credit derivatives and all those kinds of things, the amount of money circulating in those markets was over $600 trillion. $600 trillion in a world economy which is only producing $55 trillion of goods and services. And you know, and I would occasionally meet one of these bankers in one of these bars in Manhattan, and I kind of say, you know, how does that all compute, you know? And they kind of say, oh, well, don't worry. There's only about 10% liabilities in that $600 trillion. And I say, oh, is that also $60 trillion of liabilities against $55 trillion of total output? Yeah, well, it really is. Very comforting, thanks very much. And so you have these, but the thing is that people are extracting real wealth out of those markets. I mean, 2 years ago, about 5 of the hedge fund people drew $3 billion out of the market. You know, George Soros was one of them, John Paulson was another. And $3 billion personal remuneration in 1 year was extracted from playing in those markets. And this is real social power, and we can of course see how that real social power is being used politically right now in the current election. You can absolutely see how it is absolutely swamping the electoral process, and of course it's buying political power, buying political influence, and all the rest of it. So over the last few years we've seen these sorts of markets forming, and we've seen all of these asset bubbles jumping up. You know, I mean, for a while it was the dot-com bubble, and then when that crashed, it became the property bubble. Now, the thing about asset markets is they have a Ponzi character without a Bernie Madoff at the top. I mean, if I invest in stocks and shares, the stock market goes up a little bit, and other people say, oh, well, it looks like the market's going up, I'll invest. And so somebody else invests, and they go up further, and then we keep on going, go like this. The same thing happens in the property market. You know, I invest in property, and property goes up, and it goes up and up and up and up, until at some point or other it goes, as they always do, sort of pops. So what we've seen, I think, is a real difficulty of absorbing the surplus in meaningful ways. And this comes out in other peculiar instances. For example, in the world of consumption, you know, one of the things that Marx does a lot is to emphasize, particularly in production, is the notion of turnover time. He doesn't really emphasize the turnover time in the world of consumption. But I think actually that's been a very, very important variable which has to be paid attention to. For example, I'm still using my grandmother's knives and forks from about 1850. Now, if capital made things like that all of the time, where would its market be? So capital over time has specialized in making things that break down and fall apart and don't last, and also, of course, innovates in such a way as to render almost instantaneously obsolescent whatever it is you have. I mean, how many times have you changed your computer in the last, 10 years? And you get your iPods and your iPads, and they you drop them and they fall, So there's an incredible kind of speed up and turnover in consumption, to the point where actually one of the things that suddenly struck me is really very interesting point, is that Guy Debord wrote The Society of the Spectacle back in 1967. And one of the points there is, this is becoming a society of spectacle. But the great thing about a spectacle is it's instantaneously consumed. So actually urban life has been built more and more around the notion of the spectacle. And therefore we're constantly involved in more and more, caught up in the spectacle, even to the point where we get so absorbed in it that we become the spectacle. I mean, you only got to look what's going on Facebook and seeing everybody's kind of becoming a spectacle to everybody else. So the spectacle becomes very, very significant. And you look at something like, you say, look, for example, at the amount of money and resources that are being spent on, saying, the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, and you go back and you look, okay, and they become more and more spectacular over time. And vast amounts of money and so on are put into just creating this spectacle. And of course, the interesting thing about nearly every city that's ever run these things is they go bankrupt afterwards. Los Angeles didn't, but it's no accident that Greece has gone bankrupt, actually. I mean, the Athens spectacle and the Athens Olympic Games was supposed to have helped Greece immensely. It didn't help it at all. And so, if you like, the consumerism and the spectacle are going together. So social life and political life and daily life has been changing dramatically, partly in response to the need to accelerate turnover times, not only in production, but to accelerate turnover times in the world of consumption. Now, what I said earlier was that capital moves things around temporarily from one kind of crisis to another. The way I look at the situation today is very much impacted by the way in which I interpret the crisis of the late 1960s, early 1970s. The big crisis was really, global crisis was the 1970s. What was the problem then? The problem, fundamental problem, as I define it, is that labor was too powerful. And labor was well organized, and labor markets were largely confined to nation-state configurations within a world system in which each nation-state was in charge of its own fiscal and monetary policy. And what that meant was that social democratic parties, socialist parties could push for political power, and they could use that political power to gain in the social wage as well as the kind of real wage, So labor was getting more and more powerful in the 1960s, 1970s within that framework of nation states, which were fairly confined. Now, as we went through the 1960s, there were various attempts to solve that problem from the standpoint of capital. One of the big attempts was to loosen up immigration. And it's a bit astonishing now, given all the way we find ourselves looking at the immigration problem through the public, public perceptions. What we look at is sort of well, these immigrants are a problem. But back then, you find the French government was actually subsidizing the import of Maghrebian labor. The Germans were bringing in the guest workers from Turkey. The Swedes were bringing in people from Yugoslavia and Portugal and all the rest of it. And the British were drawing on their empire. And of course, in this country, in 1965, you had this very far-reaching sort of rewriting of immigration law, which allowed US access to the world global labor reserves. Now, that didn't work too well, so you had to do something else. And so you get this crisis of the 1970s, which arises out of the fact that it looks like, what sometimes the Marxists like to call a profit squeeze. Labor was getting too much of the pie. And not only was it getting it was also getting politically powerful. And the capitalist class decided to try and break the power of labor because, so there was, if you like, a campaign that developed in the 1970s to do that. Now, how did they do that? Well, one of the ways was, in fact, to go global. And to do that, however, you had to set up a financial system that could shift money around the world with relative fluidity and relative ease. And again, the literature back in the 1970s is really very interesting. When you're reading it about financial services in the 1970s, people were talking about something called financial repression. Finance was so regulated, and it was so, interstate banking was banned in this country, at that time. And the banking structure, so everybody's kind of saying there's something really wrong with the financial structure. Not only can't we move, is it difficult to move money around within the United States, it's difficult to move it around internationally. So you start to get a huge kind of push to reform and deregulate the financial system, which begins to set in during the sort of 1970s, and it continues up until the point of about the mid-1980s with the unification of the global stock markets in what's called the Big Bang in 1986. So you liberate the financial institutions because you need them to be able to sort of shoot the money around the world. And the result was the financial institutions connived at the deindustrialization of the United States. I mean, all that deindustrialization that occurred in the 1980s, with so on, well, it was facilitated by Wall Street and facilitated by the financial institutions. And of course, as they're liberated, they get a great deal of possibility and they can start to invent things and innovate and all this kind of stuff. And so we get to the point where infectious greed and irrational exuberance, as Alan Greenspan called it, sort of take over the whole kind of financial system. And that actually then is the core of one of the big problems that started to emerge in the late 1990s into today. So we got out. One of the ways, one of the revisions of the whole structure of how global capitalism was working required liberating finance to the point where finance could become hegemonic, dominant, and ultra greedy as well, and no question about it. What this also was associated with was the breaking down of nation-state barriers. What globalization did, of course, was to break down trading barriers so that you could start to talk about the global car and the global television set and all those kinds of things. And along with that, there came sort of other innovations like containerization and so on, which allowed movement of goods and services around the world much more easily. So this is, if you like, another aspect of the reform. So labor is weakened by the fact that its protective cocoon of the nation state is no longer able to protect it. It can't assemble power inside of that as easily, and it cannot exercise influence upon the social wage in the same way that it once did. Now, on top of that, you then have the direct assault upon labor. So you invented people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and General Pinochet and the Argentinian generals and all the rest of it to absolutely sock it to labor and destroy all the labor institutions which are likely to protect the social wage. So in effect, what happened was a crisis that was focused on the capital-labor relation because labor was too strong was resolved by the time you get to about 1980, by the fact that capital had access to all of the global labor reserves wherever it wanted to go. It could move around at ease, do what it wanted. And in effect, you move from a situation where labor was probably too empowered for the good health of capitalism in 1960s, early 70s, to the point where labor is unempowered. And in fact, capital is too empowered right now relative to labor. Now, what this does is to say that nobody in this crisis, as far as I know, has actually said, well, the problem is greedy unions. You know, I mean, nobody's saying that. But that was the chorus that was there in the 1970s. You know, so you know, if you like, the dynamics of the thing have changed, but you can see how this crisis is flowing out of the other one. Now, the result of this was you've got something in the 1970s onwards which is called wage repression. Wages are pretty stagnant because capital can hold them pretty stagnant. It has high unemployment, Reagan recession, 10% unemployment, same bit in Britain and much of Europe. So wages are pretty stagnant and there's no increase in wages. The result of that is that the share of wages in national income is declining. And it's declining in all of the advanced capitalist countries. And interestingly, the data on China show it was been declining in China since 1980 or so. So labor has less and less money. And then the big issue arises, well, who's going to buy the product if labor doesn't, if labor doesn't have it? Well, the answer was, well, the financial system can assist them by letting them go into debt, encourage them to go into debt. And of course, what we then saw was the huge increase in household indebtedness, a tripling of household indebtedness from 1980 to around now. And you dealt with the problem of effective demand in the market by kind of saying that the gap between what labor's getting and what it can purchase is going to be covered by increasing resort to credit financing of consumption. But if you've got two graphs, one is flat and the other's going like this, at some point or other the tension between them gets too great and it pops, you know. So, and that of course is one of the things that's hit right now. So there's a big problem of keeping demand going. Now, the theory has always been that capitalists, when they're given money, a lot of money, as they were given under the Reagan tax reform and all the rest of it, and as they got out of the fact that labor was in a repressed condition, the capitalists would invest. But invest in what? Again, the question here is not investing in something socially useful, it's investing in something that's profitable. So where were the profits to be had? Well, initially, yes, they could be had in production because wages were low. But a lot of money starts pouring into production, and after a while, competition starts to become significant because you've also broken down nation-state barriers not only to financial flows, but also to international competition. So you move from a situation of monopoly power in the 1960s, and there are books being written about monopoly capital in the 1960s. The official thesis of the French Communist Party was about we were in a stage of state monopoly capitalism in the 1960s. And this then is broken, however, by a much more competitive environment in the 1970s. Money is pouring in and things get very competitive. So what looked like a sort of oligopolistic situation in Detroit in the American auto industry, by the time you get to the 1980s, is a highly competitive situation where you've got the Japanese and the German car companies coming in, competing with Detroit, and then later on, of course, the Korean, and now the Chinese are coming in. I mean, it's just kind of, you know, so you get a highly competitive economy, and competition often leads to price reductions. And price reductions mean profit margins go down. And the result is, the 1980s, you get a very peculiar economy. You get a low-wage, low-profit economy. And it's at that point capitalists say, why would I go invest in production when I can only get 3 or 4% rate of return? I want something more, lucrative than that, and that's where the asset markets come in. And they don't necessarily invest in production at all, and that's where you start to get all of the asset bubbles sort of coming in that I mentioned earlier, with all of the impacts they've had on the economy. So again, what we find is a trend here, which is an interesting trend in that the way we came out of the crisis in the 1970s defined how we were going to get into this one we're in right now. And then the big question arises, well, how are we going to get out of this one? And there are two sorts of issues here. First is, how are we going to get out of it if there is no macro protest? Well, one of the things that's happened, of course, is that the banks have been bailed out. Now, this is actually exactly what has been happening all along. In the Mexican debt crisis of 1982, Mexico was about to go bankrupt. If they had gone bankrupt, they would have defaulted on their debts, and their debts were held by the New York investment banks. In other words, if Mexico had declared bankruptcy, the New York investment banks would have gone under. And the United States had to rescue the New York investment banks. So what it did was it went to Mexico and it said all kinds of things, to the bourgeoisie down there, don't dare do this, don't go bankrupt, we'll bail you out. And they put together the IMF and the Treasury, and they bailed out the government of Mexico, on condition that the government of Mexico recouped it all by austerity. And the living standards of people in Mexico, which is not a very rich country after all, went down by about 25% in the following 5 to 8 years. This was a standard procedure of an International Monetary Fund structural adjustment program. You bail out the banks and sock it to the people. Now, what have we done? We bailed out the banks, right? And everywhere the banks have been bailed out. Now we're saying, oh, but the result of that is we've got all of these huge deficits. How are we going to pay off these deficits? Austerity. Hey, it's sock it to the people time. And that's what the British are doing, that's what the Germans are doing, that's what the Republicans want to do here. In other words, this is a repeat of the neoliberal trick of what was done, and actually, it's very interesting being in Latin America. I mean, I have some very good friends in Brazil and Argentina, and they're kind of laughing and saying, you guys are going through a structural adjustment program without the IMF. And isn't it nice? Now you know what it's like, Now, yeah, we've been through 5 of them in the last 20 years, so, ha-ha. Isn't it great to watch you squirm, But that, in effect, is what's happening. And this says that the plan as it is at the moment is indeed to reconstitute the neoliberal game. And the neoliberal game was always about protecting financial institutions at the expense of the people and using state power. It was never about withdrawing state power. It was always about using state power to create a good business climate. And that meant giving tax subsidies and all kinds of goodies to the corporations. I mean, it's amazing. Corporations are supposed to be, vigorous entrepreneurial institutions, but they always need a vast amount of state money to do what they do. So this is the neoliberal game that's coming out of it. With, however, some very significant features to it. The first is the neoliberal game was always about reconstituting class power. And the concentrations of class power that are now emerging are absolutely astonishing. You think in a depression that, well, okay, yeah, a few of the top guns get hurt, and a few, what's his name, Fold had to sell off his art collection or something like that. Poor guy. But actually, those who are left are really richer than ever. I mean, when I mentioned $3 billion in 1 year for Paulson and Soros et al., I mean, the concentrations of wealth on Wall Street, the bonuses which are just about to be declared on Wall Street at the end of this year are going to be humongous. I mean, there is this huge, and this is not only going on in this country. The number of billionaires in India doubled last year. The number of billionaires emerging in China is kind of, I mean, there is this huge concentration of wealth going on. which has been the long trend since the 1970s anyway. So that's becoming even more consolidated than ever before. So that's the second thing, however, is that we were always told over these last, 20, 30 years, Margaret Thatcher and everybody else always kind of said, well, a free market always produces a result which is to the benefit of all. Didn't Adam Smith say that, after all? I mean, Adam Smith only said it in one line. And again, careful about the one-liners. If you go read Adam Smith, it's much more complicated than that. And at some point or other, you find out he's very suspicious of a lot of the high bourgeoisie and what they're going to do with this. Now, but the legitimacy of the system has broken down. If only we would see it. If only we would stop having sand thrown in our eyes by tea parties and Fox News and all the rest of it, who kind of just, And I actually makes what gets me mad about this is not that they're doing what they're doing, but all of the other media are debating what they're doing. There was a U.S. social forum in Detroit where 15,000 people came together to talk about an alternative. Did it ever get on any of the press anywhere? Did you ever see any accounts on it on MSNBC? Did you ever see any? No, you didn't see anything about it at all. They're so busy going on trying to ridicule the Tea Party, but by ridiculing, they actually emphasize their importance and their existence. You should ignore the bastards and keep them out of the way. We should be talking about the alternative, which then comes back to the whole kind of question of where's the resistance, where's the outrage, where's the organisation to say this shall not be? And this also gets back to something much broader, which is what forms of organisation can actually take up this kind of question of trying to do something in relationship to that compound growth that cannot go on forever for environmental and social and political and all kinds of other reasons. In other words, there's a huge kind of problem which needs to be addressed. And one of the things it seemed to me very important was to sort of start to say, look, we have to think about that and start to articulate what the alternative might look like, some alternative might look like. And we have to actually think in organizational forms which are going to address the nature of the problems that we really face. But there is not, as it were, right now, the outrage there, and I think that this is one of the things that outrage has to be connected to analysis. In fact, the way in which outrage has been channeled into the Tea Party is is really extremely interesting, because it seems to me there has to be an alternative way to channel outrage into an outrage against capital. I mean, if you talk to the ordinary people in the Tea Party and say, are you in favour of the immense fortunes being built up on Wall Street? Are you in favour of the immense fortunes of those people who are funding almost everything? And are you in favour of Rupert Murdoch's immense fortunes and his power? The answer would be probably not. So how come, you're in this kind of political world? I mean, there's a thing here where we have to connect some analysis, but the analysis is not there either. And this is one of the things that I was really trying to remedy in the Enigma book, is to say, look, there is a way of creating an analysis of this, which talks about the dynamics, explains why this has been going on, not just simply now, but it's been going on for a long time. And there is a theory of crisis formation and crisis resolution which you can look at, and there's a history of it and a geography of it, which is explicable. And therefore, when we start to look at that, there's a way of taking that analysis and starting to incorporate it into an understanding of what the nature of the problem is. In exactly the same way that the economists, when they replied to Her Majesty, said we were not aware of systemic risk, we have a whole population that is totally unaware of the systemic qualities of what capitalism is about, and therefore cannot locate the problem in relationship to capitalism. And it's very interesting, where a lot of the preliminary surveys on those people who've lost their homes and been foreclosed, who do they blame? Themselves. Well, that's a good neoliberal trick. Personal responsibility. And to a degree, we've all become neoliberals now because we believe that crap. And we have to stop believing in it, and we have to actually say, there's a systemic problem here. And the systemic problem requires systemic solutions. And there's absolutely no attempt to do so, in part because the politics of this country are completely dominated by what I call the party of Wall Street, which is as deeply implanted in the Democratic Party as it is in the Republican Party. And the party of Wall Street effectively dominates discourse and dominates the political process. And therefore, most of us are unrepresented in terms of our wants, needs, and desires. And that is one of the things that needs to be remedied. Now, the other thing is there are, of course, many, many movements around, all over the place. And one of the things I did at the end of the book is to start to talk about them, you know. You know, there's an autonomista movement, there's an anarchist movement, there are the traditional kind of left, you know, revolutionary communist parties, there are the NGOs, there are all these sorts of configurations. And when you look at it, you see a sort of a chaos of movements, many of which are extremely conflictual, and many of which have certain commitments to organizational forms. And one of the criticisms I would end up with, and I didn't say this as explicitly as I should have done because I've been criticized for what I wrote in that chapter, and I've now decided, well, I better counterattack. And the main line of counterattack is to say, look, I think there's a fetishism of organizational form out there. There are groups out there who kind of say, the only organizational form is one that is democratic and horizontal. And you kind of say, yeah, fine, okay, how are you going to deal with global warming that way? How are you going to deal with, you know, sort of major problems of SARS epidemics or something like that way? Don't you understand that actually in order to do that, you need to actually contemplate that you need hierarchies somewhere in the thing? You can try and democratize the hierarchies, but imagine that, you know, and the other extreme, you find yourself, you know, talking with the Revolutionary Communist Party who insist on as a vanguard party, and it has to be the proletariat in motion. And you kind of say, well, you know, the proletariat has changed. It's not where you think it is. And the whole concept of the proletariat needs to be, you know, rejigged and changed. And I've always had a problem, actually, with the Marxist definition of the proletariat because, you know, it's always about factory labor, and I'm always interested in cities. And I kind of say, well, the workers who build cities are as important in this as the workers in the factories. And actually, if you look at revolutions like the Paris Commune and all those kinds of things, who was involved in it? Well, it wasn't factory labor. It was many of the workers building the cities. And actually, it was so interesting. The first two measures of the Paris Commune, one was suspension of night work in the bakeries, which is a labor question. The other was moratorium on rents, which is a living place question. And I kind of say, well, you know, the unity of those two is absolutely fundamental. So a revolutionary movement has to be actually prepared to think about all those forms of labor which are now not being, you know, difficult to represent and difficult to organize. I mean, we work a little bit with Right to the City stuff in New York, and, you know, groups in New York, for instance, domestic workers. How do domestic workers get organized? And what's that all about? And can you use a sort of traditional, you know, National Labor Relations Board kind of model of organizing? No, of course you can't. So you have to think about doing something radically different in terms of the mobilization of populations. And therefore, one of the things we need to do, and I think from all organizational perspectives, is to sit back and say, how good is my organizational form in relationship to the nature of the problem which we need to address? And just by asking that question, get a little bit more flexible instead of kind of saying, you have to be my organizational form or I'm not going to talk to you. I mean, I get, you know, a lot of that. People don't like what I said about their organizational form. I'm critical of all of them to a little bit. I'm supportive of all of them and critical. But no, if you're a little bit critical of them, no, you're the enemy. You're a secret Stalinist or you're a secret something else. You know, I mean, you know, amazing the words you get from the left as soon as you depart from their favored organizational form, I can tell you. But it is a fetishism of organizational form. And it's like kind of pretending you can solve the problems of a heart attack by, I don't know, putting somebody's finger in a splint. I mean, it's just about as so the left has to actually start to think about what it is doing and why it's doing it and the way it's doing it. And there's a certain urgency, I think, to this task. Because we are going to come out of this crisis in capitalist terms, other words. And the capitalist terms are much greater concentrations of wealth and power. You know, almost a dictatorship of the world's central bankers. And you know, a political system that is so corrupt. I mean, who looking at this election can say this is not a totally corrupt, and it's legalized corruption. That's the terrible thing about it. It's legalized corruption of democracy. And there has to be something radically different in terms of organizational form and the like. So what I was trying to do was to come up with the analysis and then try to talk a little bit about both the geography and the dynamics of it, and then also to talk through some of the organizational forms and really make a plea for starting to think about the relationship between organizational forms and the nature of the task that really now confronts us. Because we either come out of it on their terms or we come out of it on our terms. And there's no excuse, it seems to me, for sitting here passively and say, I don't know what my terms are. You have to find out what your terms are, and you have to think about, you know, what the organizational form is going to be. Well, I've talked for long enough, so thanks very much. I think we have half an hour for discussion, I think, right?
We've got about 30 minutes. We don't have microphones circulating, so if you have a question, please be succinct and very clear and loud. And David's going to field his own questions. As I said, we do have to stop exactly at 8:30.
I'm going to take them in a bunch of threes. I can just about remember three. So, yeah, 1, 2, 3, yeah.
Is capitalism in crisis, or is it not? That is, it is a diminishing rate of profit. It's been a continuous crisis of the last 2 generations at least. Then how can it be that the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few accelerates all the more, and the power of capital over labor increases? Is it triumphant, or is it in crisis?
So there were two here. Okay.
Marx had concentrated on technological evolution in some of his analysis, and more recent work has looked at technologies as new combinations of existing technologies, suggesting that there's a combinatorial expansion in potential technologies, meaning that a exponential increase in dematerialized wealth is certainly a possibility. So I wondered if you could comment on the technological advance.
This is a question relating to sort of the idea that since 1970 we've had sort of a global crisis for labor. If we look at Marx, he's concerned primarily with human emancipation and the role of alienation in labor.
Mm-hmm.
Given that that's not a problem that was resolved in the 70s, and that the expansion of global wealth has brought a tremendous improvement in living standards in the third world, could we not see sort of the movements of global capital since 1970 as an emancipatory project that bet one-sidedly because of the nature of capital?
Okay, let me combine the first 2 questions. One of the things I had to do in the book was to think about Marx's theory of social change, the dynamics of economic and social change. And again, I used my understanding of what he does as opposed to the one-liners. And what he does is to suggest, and the way I represented it was to say, look, there are 7 moments in the social process. One is about the relation to nature. Another is about the nature of technology. And then there's social relations. And then there's production. There's daily life. There's mental conceptions of the world, institutional arrangements. And all of these hang together as a totality, and all of them co-evolve. And if you look at the dynamics of the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, what you'll see is a movement across all of those dimensions. The relation to nature was fundamentally reconfigured. Technologies, obviously, and social relations and mental conceptions, all of them changed dramatically, as did daily life. But capitalism is a permanently revolutionary force. And if you think about the way in which all of those elements hung together, say in 1970, and how they hang together today in a particular geographical place, you would see a different kind of world. You know, I mean, there were no photo. Can you imagine living in a world with no photocopying machines? I mean, when you did your courses back then, you had a Roneo and you turn it around. Yeah, you remember, right? You turn it around and this horrible pink mauve kind of thing came out, and you had to run them off one by one. And of course no cell phones and all this kind of stuff. But also the social relations have changed a lot in all sorts of dimensions, including, of course, the social relations which are associated with labour and work and the meaning of work and the like. And while, you know, you can kind of say there was alienated labour back in the 1960s, which is true, it was alienated in a very different way than it is today. The alienation today is very much more about insecurity, and it's all about repressions of various kinds. So it's a different kind of world, and you know, and of course the social solidarities which compensated in some ways for those alienations through, I don't know, even trade union organization and institutions of that kind are no longer as powerful and significant as they once were. And there have been dramatic transformations in technology. I mean, when I was reminded of this a couple of weeks ago, I was in Baltimore and I met a steel worker who was employed at Bethlehem Steel. There are now 2,500 people employed at Bethlehem Steel. Back in the 1960s, there were 37,000. And you know, we all know what that has meant in terms of you know. So yes, there are transformations in the form that alienation takes and the like. But what this also suggests is that technology and technological configuration is only one dimension. I mean, and there's this tendency to think of Marx sometimes as emphasizing the technology, the technological dimension, and often the one-liner is the productive forces, revolutions in productive forces, you know, are at the root of history. Well, if that's the case, how come the chapter on machinery and modern industry, where Marx talks about the way in which capitalism defined its own technology, comes at the end of the story, not at the beginning? In other words, in the 17th century, capitalism was erected, as he says, on the basis of feudal technologies and organizational forms. In other words, capitalism was already there on the basis of that technology. But it reached a limit in terms of that, and it had to therefore redefine the technological mix which was distinctively its own. So then the chapter is, you know, that long chapter is about how it did that, which is then also about transforming mental conceptions. So that, for instance, the word technology or industry in the 18th century was associated with art. So you'll find arts and industries kept together. There's a metro stop in Paris called Arts et Métiers, you know, but then it became technology and science, and this became, you know, so the technological moment is just one moment, and the notion of co-evolution becomes therefore very, very important, and therefore that leads me in at the end to talk about a co-revolutionary movement from capitalism to socialism or communism or whatever. In other words, you cannot imagine a revolution which is going to be simply on one of those dimensions. It has to be on all of those dimensions, in institutional arrangements, daily life, and all the rest of it. And there's no one single major problem in the world right now that doesn't require all of those elements to be revolutionized in some way. You think of climate change. You want to do something about climate change? Everybody says, oh, there's a technological fix. Well, actually, no. You can't deal with that without changing daily life. We have to change our daily lives. Now, nobody wants to change it. They say, solve this climate problem without changing my daily life. Impossible. Okay? Change social relations. You know, change production systems, all the rest of it. You've got to change all of those elements. So I started to come up with a co-revolutionary theory and say a social movement has to grasp a revolutionary theory. Now, this brings me back to the first question. Is capital in crisis? There's a difference between is capitalism in crisis and are the capitalists in crisis? And actually, capitalists very frequently get themselves into a configuration where, acting in their own self-interest, they are prepared to actually crash the whole system. And Marx recalled several moments where that's the case. I mean, the chapter on the working day is one of them, but also, you know, some of the stuff about environmental degradation is also there. In other words, capitalists don't necessarily act in such a way as to preserve capitalism. And of course, one of the things that happened back in the 1930s was that actually a large segment of the capitalist class got behind the idea of actually transforming the system to save capitalism. And they realized they had to give up something in order to do it. Right now, we are in exactly the opposite situation. As I see it, it's not only individual capitalists are basically prepared to crash the whole system in order to try and preserve their own particular wealth and power, but factions of capital are prepared to do that. And you see that, I might think, most clearly in terms of the dynamics of Wall Street. Wall Street folk, believe they're entitled, think they do fantastic things for everybody, although I have to tell you, living where I live, I occasionally come across a drunk banker in a bar in Upper East Side, and one the other night actually started crying, and he looked at me and said, "It's all fraud, it's all fraud." I wish I could get him on tape, you know. So your question is a very appropriate one. For them, for George Soros, this is not a crisis, you know, and for John Paulson, this is not a crisis. This is a great opportunity. They're racking it up. Now, Soros is an interesting character because he does see that there's a real systemic problem, and you've got to try to save capitalism in order to, you know. So in the long run, he is concerned about that, but the rest of them are not. So right now, you can kind of see this systemically that capitalism is likely to change its spots. Now, capitalism is in crisis in a variety of ways. For example, the whole kind of the fiscal stuff right now is really pretty hairy. And I think they are prepared to continue to create more and more fictitious capital for precisely the reason that real production is not terribly remunerative. So we could move into a world in which they sort of, and you know, there's this. It's very interesting. Giovanni Arrighi always used to use this Brodelian view that there are three levels. There's the market level, and then there's daily life level, and then the capitalists are in the attic almost, sort of playing games up in the attic. And they're not about the market at all. They're just about simply gathering wealth and power. And it looks to me actually we're more and more like in that kind of model. That actually we try and live our daily lives in a situation where the market is supposed to be acting to the benefit of all, whereas there are these people up the top who are actually manipulating pretty much everything they want, including information, including political process, as well as the market. So I think the question is a good one. Who's in crisis? Well, you know, there's a lot of people in this country in crisis. There are people who have come out of crisis. In say China, where you know, if a lot of peasant populations have been incorporated into the labor process, they went through a real problem at a certain point, and there was this crash in China, and then they've come out of it a little bit, and now, of course, there is this very interesting moment where, for whatever reason, the government is either prepared or feels forced to tolerate strikes, and is actually contemplating a very Keynesian move, which is to re-empower labor by raising wage rates. And so wage rates in China have been shooting upwards with an interesting kind of corollary, which is that it's offshoring out of China now. Jobs are going out of China to Cambodia, and you can kind of say, well, that's liberating Cambodia in a certain kind of way. And yeah, there's a sort of a joke, and there's about you know, there's only one thing worse than being exploited, and that's not being exploited. And I kind of, you know, there's that kind of dynamic, and there's always this problem about, you know, the dynamics of capitalism. And I don't think that capitalism has historically been all bad at all. It's created a situation of a sort where we can actually construct something which is radically alternative. And the big question is, why aren't we doing it? Yeah. One, two. Let me get one, two, and three. Right.
I wanted to make a quick aside about your comment of fetishization among a lot of left groups. Renata Adler wrote a funny article in about 1967 or 68 about the New Left Convention. It's here in Chicago. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I remember a quote from Upton Sinclair when he ran for governor of California. He first ran as a socialist. He got like maybe 60,000 votes. Then he ran on that epic thing, I think it was economic progress in California. He got like 800,000. And he was saying that, you know, Americans are never going to accept socialism.
Right.
To label it as
Right.
such. So I was hoping that you might make some comments of how you can deal with those sort of confirmation biases and fundamental attribution errors
Right.
that are, you know,
Right.
okay, our elites have sold all the jobs off, you know, to China, cheap labor, cheap resources. So who do we blame? The impoverished Mexicans that are dispossessed because of NAFTA, you know, who come here just
right.
for the jobs that none of us would take in a heartbeat.
Sorry, who was next? Yeah.
From everything you've said, everybody said capitalism is going to come out of it. And the reason I ask that is when you mentioned Origi, if you go to Manny Wallerstein, he said in the 70s the system was going down the tubes. And it does seem, at least to some of us more pessimistic than you, it is going to go down the tubes. And sort of a related question, since none of us have the ear of Wall Street bankers except when they're drunk as skunks at a bar. There are a number of, you know, what we might call the left bourgeois economists that have alternative answers. For example, when you shared a platform with Galbraith not too terribly long ago, that the whole system is a Ponzi scheme because of illegal greed. And then you get even better one. Krugman was bad regulators, and with Wright, we need more consumption. Now, these ideas are just as silly as God knows what. But, you know, my question is, given the fact that the bourgeois economists have no more clue, Marxists do, why do you think we're going to get out of it? Why do you think we're not going down the tubes and going down big?
You know, I always thought the definition of the working class as being doubly free was better than working in industries. But that said, it seems to me that we need a new, the thing that made the industrial working class a good, you know, good job, pay well, and all this was a series of labor movement in the 30s and 40s. But so it seems to me we need a new labor movement today. What do you think of the prospects of this? You know, international, free of the Democrats, like that could actually, you know, turn the poor, low-wage jobs that we have now into good jobs. And just real quick, you didn't mention kind of the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, right? You kind of brought that up. And it always seemed to me that I've always been suspicious of how much of a division there really is between those. It always seems more of a symbiotic relationship. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's symbiotic as far as my pension fund is concerned, yeah. You know, I listen to the news and I rub my hands with glee, and then I think about my pension fund and go, oh God, you know. So yes, we are all, I mean, I think one of the reasons I like Marx is he deals with roles rather than persons, and of course we take on many roles. But I think the analysis would work with roles. I think there is a lot of discussion. I mean, one of the things that came out of the U.S. Social Forum, I didn't manage to get there myself, but I gather that there's a lot of interest now in how to organize, you know, home care, work, how to organize domestic workers, restaurant workers. In other words, there's a lot of interest right now. I mean, I hate the term, but in Europe they like to call it the precariat, and I don't like it. But you see what they mean. It's people who are in part-time, insecure jobs, which are spread-eagled all over the place. And you know, I mean, organizing a factory is, you know, workers pouring out of the gates one thing, but organizing. But there is a lot of interest in that. And I know that some of the regular unions have tried. I mean, SEIU has, for example, tried to get into that field. So I think there are new models, but it cannot be traditional union for a variety of reasons. So most of them tend to call themselves human rights organizations. But the problem with that is at some point or other they need some assistance, and they then become an NGO, and revolution by NGO is a non-starter in my view. And I, you know, some of the people I work with is a guy called Max Rameau who works for Take Back the Land, who kind of says, well, the most revolutionary thing we could do is disband all the NGOs, and then we'd have a real revolutionary movement on our hands. But so I think there are issues of that sort. I think the question of, you know, capitalism is thing that strikes me is, and actually, again, reading Marx in terms of what he what he actually says in terms of his analysis, it's remarkably flexible and adaptable. And I was ruminating on this when people start to talk about a financial crisis relating to when people want to talk about an environmental crisis, for example. Historically, capitalism has encountered many phases where people kind of said, you know, there's a scarcity in nature, it's all over, you know, the Malthusian story is coming in, it's all over. But historically, it's been very, very fast to adapt. And I think its adaptability is something that, again, the left has not really very well thought through. You very often find the left kind of organizing around a problem that's already gone away, already disappeared, or organizing around a model, which is where I come back to the kind of question of the sort of factory labor kind of model of organizing. So I don't share the view that it's going down the chute. I think that it can reconstitute itself, but again, at what cost? And whose cost? And it's very clear what the neoliberal model was about in Latin America during the 1980s and 1990s was that capitalism was sustaining itself at immense cost, both environmental and social. And to the degree that there's been some sort of resistance emerging in Latin America, and you can sort of think of Morales and so on, you see a kind of resistance to bearing those costs. We are not going to bear the costs. And how that's going to work out, who knows, and whether that can be co-opted into, and that's the other thing, the way in which capital can take what looks like a resistance movement and turn it into something which is part of its own dominant praxis is also very sophisticated. But again, I think this has to be understood in terms of that dynamics of what I was talking about. There's different moments of social change which are integrated into the co-revolutionary process, which constitutes a capitalist society. So I don't share the view that it's all downhill. Now I forgot, what was the other one?
About the bourgeois economists.
Oh, the bourgeois economists. Well, you know, I mean, what's interesting, actually, if you look what Krugman was writing about, say, 10 years ago and what he's writing about now, and some of them have turned turtle about things, you know, Jeffrey Sachs, who obviously wants to be Mother Teresa or something. And he turns around and kind of, you know, tries, you know, having screwed half of the world, he now wants to try and rescue the other half. So you know, and you know, Stieglitz likes to sort of hunt with the hounds and run with the hares and all this kind of stuff. There's an interesting kind of debate going on, of course, as to it's really over the Keynesian question. And I wrote a piece on why the stimulus package can't work in this country a couple of years back, and it was pretty correct. I basically said there's no way you can have a Keynesian project in this country for a variety of reasons. And the reasons were partly technical but also political. There was no way in which you would be able to get it through, and of course you can't. I mean, and it was interesting that Larry Summers scaled back he did get a proposal which was 1.2 trillion, and he scaled it back to just below 800 billion, when actually you probably would have needed at least 2 trillion to have got out of the difficulty. But then the issue was, what would the 2 trillion go into? And one of the big areas it should go into, you shouldn't put it into tax cuts because that doesn't really work. You've got to put it into infrastructural projects. And so what would be the infrastructural project of the United States right now? And there wasn't one on the drawing board at all. I mean, in the 1950s, you had the interstate highway system and the integration of the global economy, the whole U.S. economy into, you know, California and the South, all this kind of stuff. You had a huge kind of project of this kind. You know, what was this going to be used for? Well, another bout of suburbanization or something? That would get this much worse, and you couldn't do it. So there was no ready-to-hand project. There's no thinking about what needed to be done that the stimulus could have been spent on, which would have been productive in relationship to the dynamics of the U.S. economy. But I then went on to point out that the Chinese were in a very different situation. They needed to integrate their whole economy. The whole interior is not integrated, and they want to take stuff west. They wanted to do the equivalent of an interstate highway system, and actually their infrastructural investments are very much modeled, it seems to me, very much on what happened in this country in the 1950s and the 1960s. So they had ready to hand a huge infrastructural project. They put in $600 billion alone into infrastructural projects. And then they told their banks to lend to everybody, and so there's a massive kind of urbanization process taking place in China. And the other element in the Keynesian program, which of course would never have flown in this country, was you would have to re-empower labor. Now the Chinese are re-empowering labor, so the Chinese do have a kind of Keynesian project on hand. Now whether the Keynesian project in China can last, whether it's really going to be productive, or whether a lot of it is speculative, and the latest I heard was that property prices in Shanghai doubled last year, and in fact there's a huge kind of set of potentially non-earning assets in all of this development that's going on there, so it could be a real problems in China. So I don't see. So there are all sorts of question marks about the Chinese project, but it is closer to a Keynesian project than is possible in the United States or would be possible in Europe. So you know, and whether that can entrain enough of the rest of the world economy to actually keep some sort of growth syndrome in motion for about the next 5-10 years is a sort of open question. My guess is it's going to possibly do some of that. So, but this, of course, then is associated very much with the other aspect of Arrighi's thesis, which is that, of course, we're in a hegemonic shift, in which you know, East and Southeast Asia are emerging as centers of political economic power, which are crucial to the dynamics of the global economy, and which can't be pushed around. And you know, you can see, you know, how far the U.S. gets when it tries to push, you know, China to revalue its currency, and basically the Chinese tell you to go take a jump, and the U.S. can't do anything, and so the power shift that's going on is palpable. It's right there before our eyes, but this is of course one of the aspects of the system. But in part it's occurring, and again, partly because of the financial reform which allowed capital to flow to China in the way it did, and also the way in which the Chinese have the equivalent of a Keynesian program, which they don't need anybody like you know, Krugman or Robert Reich or anybody else to tell them about. I mean, they just go ahead and do it, and so yeah, there's a dynamics there, and I think the economics problem is, you know, the economists' problem. I mean, a whole profession failed, you know, and it's like the bankers. They got bonuses for crashing the world's financial system, and I haven't noticed the economists have lost any power in academia. Have they? No, they seem to be just as arrogant as they always were, you know. Including. By the way, that includes Marxist economists, unfortunately. We have time for just one more question.
You mentioned Soros, and I read where he and Stiglitz have declared that the paradigm is broken. The reason the invisible hand didn't work is because it was never there in the first place. And they've started this Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I was wondering if you had any insight into what direction they were headed, or whose thinking they were attracting beyond themselves.
Certainly not mine. That I can assure you. Well, even God, what's his name? The legal economist in Chicago. Posner has said, you know, we believe the efficient market hypothesis and we were wrong, and therefore, you know, I mean, they're all coming out with mea culpas of this kind, you know, and now saying, well, we need some sort of regulatory kind of framework and all the rest of it. And so I imagine that's where Soros and Stiglitz are headed. It's just you know, the language in which you would use it. In other words, it was you're still in search of efficient markets. You just realize that the efficient market hypothesis upon which everything was predicated is wrong, and therefore you need to find a way to make markets. And you know, there's some interesting technical problems. I mean, most people would say to you, you know, you can't abolish hedge funds because they actually do some good things, and you kind of say, well, you sort of look a bit surprised, and you say, well, what? And you know, and there is a rationale that kind of says, well, they do smooth out some risks and do that. But again, how do you regulate? How do you keep banking from becoming over-the-counter, you know, shadow banking system? What do you do about it? So I think that that's probably where they're headed. But I don't know. They're not headed in a Marxist direction, that I can assure you.
Right, I know we've got lots more questions, but we have to cut it off because, you know, thinking as a materialist, we have to feed our speaker at some point. The talk is going to be on a website shortly. We're taping it, so it will be posted. If you want to replay, want to look at it again, please do so. Ironically, Rita said we're trying to get Jeffrey Sachs. I hope he doesn't check our website. So thanks very much, David. Please join me in thanking Mark. Is that yours or is it?
No, it's